Snow fell heavily on New York City that January night. Thick flakes settled on the windows of luxury mansions in Greenwich, Connecticut, blurring the streetlights into hazy patches of yellow and orange. Kenneth Miller drove down the empty avenue, gripping the steering wheel of his BMW so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. The engine purred quietly, but a storm of chaos raged in his head, louder than any blizzard. At 32, he had built a renewable energy empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Now he was watching his fortune slip through his fingers like ice-cold water. Every morning, the papers screamed about corruption. His name dragged through the headlines like a curse. Investors were threatening to pull their capital, the banks were tightening the noose, and his desk was piled high with financial reports that all told one cruel truth. Bankruptcy was closing in, fast and unavoidable. He stopped the car in front of his glass-walled residence. The house had been his pride and joy, a monument of modern architecture with panoramic windows and a smart home system. It had cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Now, it felt like a cold mausoleum for his dying dreams. When he pushed open the heavy front door, he expected to hear nothing but the echo of his own footsteps on the marble floor. The house felt dead, chilly despite the central heating set to a perfect 70 degrees. The air smelled of cleaning solutions and freshly polished wood. His housekeeper always made sure everything gleamed with an impersonal perfection. But tonight, something was wrong. From his study, his sanctuary of fine oak and cutting-edge technology, came the rustle of turning pages. The sound was barely audible, but in the dead silence, it was as loud as a thunderclap. His heart began to pound. Who would dare enter his private office? A burglar, or maybe a competitor searching for incriminating documents. His company was on the verge of collapse, but he still had enemies ready to deliver the final blow. He moved down the hallway, his steps muffled by a thick Persian rug. The walls were lined with contemporary art, investments that now seemed like laughable extravagances. He pushed open the study door, ready to confront the intruder. Inside, hunched in front of his enormous monitor, sat Helen Sokolowski, a cleaner in a grey uniform, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, rubber gloves still on her hands. Her small frame looked even more diminutive, surrounded by the massive wood furniture. For nearly 10 years, she had moved through his life unnoticed, cleaning in silence, always gone before he returned from the office. He knew her only as a name on the payroll and from the occasional brief good morning in the elevator. Now she was at his computer, in front of the confidential financial reports that could destroy what little was left of his company. "What are you doing?" Kenneth's voice cut through the air like a knife. Helen jumped, startled, but she didn't run. She turned slowly, her tired eyes reflecting more dignity than fear. She was maybe 40, but she looked older. Her face was etched with fine lines, her hands chapped and rough from chemical cleaners. There she stood, this invisible woman who for years had been nothing more than a shadow moving in the corners of his life. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I saw things that didn't add up. I couldn't just ignore it." Kenneth let out a dry, humorless laugh. The absurdity of the situation hit him like a slap, his cleaning lady pointing out errors in the very numbers that had been torturing his team of highly paid accountants and auditors. It was preposterous. A woman who probably hadn't even finished high school was pretending to understand complex financial transactions. But before he could throw her out, Helen walked to the monitor with surprising confidence. Her gloved fingers left faint streaks on the glass as she pointed to specific rows and columns in the spreadsheet. "Here's the problem," she said, her voice gaining strength. "These revenue drops always precede market events by 2 weeks. It's impossible to coincidentally predict every single fluctuation." She pointed out consulting contracts that had doubled in value without any justification, invoices for services no one could identify. Her finger stopped on payments sent to a company in Luxembourg, Siva Lux Holdings. "This company isn't real," she said. "I looked it up online during my lunch breaks. It's a P.O. box and a virtual address." A chill ran down Kenneth's spine. This wasn't guesswork or a random discovery. This was a methodical analysis performed by someone who understood patterns and anomalies. Helen spoke with the clarity of an expert, as if she had been studying these documents for months. "How do you know all this?" he asked, unable to hide the astonishment in his voice. Helen looked down at her hands. For a moment she seemed ashamed, as if caught doing something indecent. "I remember patterns," she finally answered. "It's a kind of obsession. The papers you threw in the trash, the reports left in the printer. The phone calls I overheard while cleaning. It all gets stored in my head and forms a picture. She took a deep breath, as if preparing for a confession that cost her a great deal. And it's because my son is sick, she added quietly. Michael is 16. He has a rare form of leukemia. He needs an experimental treatment in Germany that costs $250,000. I've already sold everything. My apartment, the car, my mother's jewelry, but it's still not enough. When I see an open door, I walk through it. Not to steal, but to understand. I'm looking for a way to help my child. Her voice broke on the last few words. Kenneth saw tears welling in the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. A heavy silence fell between them. Through the study window, the world looked like a winter fairy tale. White roofs, snow-dusted trees, romantic lights. But inside, a real-life drama was unfolding, one with no easy exit. For the first time, Kenneth truly saw this invisible woman. The calluses on her hands from hours of scrubbing and polishing, the weariness in her posture from carrying heavy buckets, but also the intelligence in her eyes and the unbreakable resolve of a mother willing to do anything for her child. "You've shown me more than my entire board of directors," he said at last. "This embezzlement, who could have access to this kind of information?" Helen didn't hesitate. "Someone in senior management, someone who knows your plans before the market does. I checked the signatures on the documents, the system login dates. All roads lead to one person. Who? Sophia King. The name struck Kenneth like a bolt of lightning. Sophia King, the elegant lawyer, his trusted partner for over a decade, the woman who had helped him build his empire from the ground up. It was unthinkable, but as Helen showed him more evidence, the pieces began to fall into place, forming a horrifying picture of betrayal. That night, as the snow fell ever thicker, two people from opposite worlds made a pact. Kenneth, cornered by his own ruin, made a desperate proposal. If Helen helped him save the company and prove Sophia's treason, he would pay for her son's treatment. Helen agreed, but not without conditions. She wanted dignity, not charity. She wanted an ID badge that didn't say cleaning staff, but financial analyst. And she wanted the creation of a scholarship program for the children of all company employees, should they succeed in saving the business. Their unlikely partnership was born in that moment, in a study filled with luxury but also desperation, where a millionaire and a cleaner discovered they needed each other to survive the coming storm. Chapter 2. The next day at the Miller Renewables office tower, a semblance of normalcy prevailed. Employees arrived promptly at 8, coffee machines gurgled on every floor, and receptionists answered calls with a polite, "Good morning." But Kenneth knew that beneath this facade, a colony of termites was eating his life's work from the inside out. Sophia King entered his office at 9:30, elegant as always in a Chanel suit. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the marble floor, and in her hand she carried a leather briefcase that cost more than the average employee's monthly salary. She smiled the same cool, confident smile he had known for years. "Kenneth, we need to talk about the financial situation," she said, settling into the armchair across from his desk. "The investors are getting more and more nervous. Maybe we should consider selling off some assets." She looked him straight in the eye, her expression a mask of concern and loyalty he had considered genuine for years. Now, after his late-night conversation with Helen, every gesture seemed like an act, every word part of a larger, sinister plan. "I'm already on it," he answered cautiously. "I'm commissioning an additional audit of all transactions from the last 2 years. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Sophia's eyes. If he hadn't been on high alert, he would have missed it, but now he saw it, a flash of anxiety, quickly concealed behind her professional mask. "That's an excellent idea," she said smoothly. "I know a great auditing firm in London. I can arrange everything." "Thanks, but I already have someone in mind," he lied. "A local firm, people who know our specific operations." After she left, Kenneth called Helen. They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in Queens, far from the upscale places where they might run into acquaintances. The place was modest, smelling of fresh bread and instant coffee. Helen was already at a corner table, dressed in a simple black sweater and faded jeans. Without her uniform, she looked younger, but the fatigue in her eyes was even more pronounced. "Sophia already knows something's up," he said, sitting across from her. "I saw it in her reaction to the audit." Helen nodded, sliding a blue notebook across the table. "I spent all night recreating from memory every document I've seen over the years," she said. "Here are the transactions that don't fit the pattern. Dates, amounts, contractors. Everything indicates that Sophia was systematically siphoning money through fictitious contracts." Kenneth opened the notebook. The pages were covered in small, neat handwriting. Helen had reconstructed the tables better than a computer could, every column perfectly aligned, every number in its place. It was the work of obsessive precision, of someone who had learned over years to be invisible and to remember everything. "Where did you get a memory like that?" he asked, his voice filled with admiration. Helen gazed out the window at the grey New York sky. The snow from the previous night was already melting, leaving brownish slush on the sidewalks. "When Michael was little, I used to read to him before bed," she said softly. "I memorized whole books so I could tell him the stories in the dark when he was afraid to fall asleep. Later, when he got sick, I would sit by his hospital bed and learn all the procedures, the names of the medications, the test results. I had to understand because no one else was going to fight for my son the way I would." Her voice was calm, but in it, Kenneth heard an entire history. A single mother who had become a medical expert just to save her child. A woman who had forged her despair into a tool for survival. "How much time do you have?" he asked gently. "The doctors are talking months, maybe a year if we're lucky," she replied. "But this experimental treatment in Hamburg could change everything. Professor Schneider is testing a gene therapy. 9 children have already recovered, 9 out of 12. Kenneth saw the hope in her eyes, that mortally dangerous hope that can either lift a person to the heavens or crush them completely. "We're going to help each other," he said decisively. "You'll get the treatment for Michael, and I'll get my company back. But we have to act quickly and carefully." The next few days were spent in preparation. Helen received a temporary contract as a financial analysis consultant and was given provisional access to the company's computer system. Officially, she occupied a small office on the 3rd floor, far from the main corridors of power. Unofficially, she was reconstructing the history of the embezzlement with a surgeon's precision, but Sophia wasn't idle. On Thursday, Helen received a call from the HR department. "Ms. Sokolowski?" The voice was formal, cold. "Please report to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. We have a few matters to discuss regarding your contract." Helen knew it was a trap, but she went. In the HR office, a young administrator was waiting for her with a stack of papers. "I'm sorry, but we have to terminate your contract," she said, avoiding Helen's gaze. "Restructuring, cost reduction. Mr. Miller personally signed off on it." Helen took the documents. Kenneth's signature was authentic, but the date was from last week before their agreement. "That's impossible," she said. "Mr. Miller approved my employment." "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," the administrator said unconvincingly. "The decision was made earlier. Please return your access card and company laptop." As Helen was leaving the building, she saw Sophia standing by a window on the 5th floor. The woman was smiling triumphantly. It was the first move in a game where the stakes were everything, but Helen didn't give up. That evening, a frantic and furious Kenneth called her. "Sophia went to the board with accusations about your hiring," he said. "She's claiming it's nepotism, that I'm using the company's crisis to place my own people." "And what did you tell them?" "The truth, that you're the best analyst I've ever met. But they only see your education, your previous job. To them, you're still the cleaning lady trying to get rich off my problems." Helen closed her eyes. For a moment, she felt that old powerlessness return, the feeling that the world was divided into those who had a voice and those who could only listen. "But I don't need their approval," she said finally. "I have everything right here." She pointed to her head. "In my kitchen at a table I bought for $50 at a flea market. I don't need a fancy office to think." Indeed, for the next few days, Helen worked from her small apartment in Astoria. At her old kitchen table, she reconstructed complex financial schemes, cross-referenced every detail online, and called institutions under the pretext of routine inquiries. Michael, growing weaker, sat beside her and helped. His young mind was brilliant with patterns and anomalies. "Mom, this Sivalux company," he said one evening, pointing at the laptop screen. "I checked its history in the web archives. It was registered the day after Mr. Miller first spoke with Ms. King about his plans for European expansion." Helen looked at her son with pride. Despite the illness, despite his weakness, his mind worked like a precision instrument. It means someone knew about his plans before they were ever officially announced. Someone from the inner circle. That night, Helen prepared for the final confrontation. She knew Sophia wouldn't stop at getting her fired from the company. The next move would be even more drastic, but Helen was ready. She had the evidence, she had a plan, and she had something Sophia didn't. The desperation of a mother fighting for her child's life. And desperation can move mountains. Chapter 3. Monday morning in New York was as grey as dirty gravel. Helen woke before dawn, a habit ingrained over years. Her apartment in Astoria consisted of 2 small rooms in a pre-war walk-up. The walls were stained with dampness, and the radiator hissed so feebly that every morning she had to put on a sweater before getting out of bed. But it was their home, the only place in the world that belonged to her and Michael. Her son was asleep in the next room, his breathing shallow and uneven. Sometimes Helen would get up in the middle of the night just to check that his chest was still rising and falling. Now she stood in his doorway, watching the pale light of dawn fall on his thin face. Michael had already lost half his hair from chemotherapy, but he was still the most beautiful boy in the world, at least in his mother's eyes. The kitchen smelled of yesterday's boiled cabbage and the herbs Helen brewed for her son. Spread across the old table were sheets of paper, her reconstruction of all the embezzlement at Kenneth's company. For the past 3 days, she had worked like an archaeologist uncovering an ancient civilization. Every number, every transaction was a piece of a larger picture of betrayal. Just then, the phone rang. It was an old landline from the 90s she'd bought at a thrift store when they moved in 10 years ago. Ms. Sokolowski? The voice was male, professional. My name is Adam Kowalski. I'm a reporter with the New York Chronicle. I'd like to talk about your work at Miller Renewables. Helen felt her heart start to race. This was what she had feared. Sophia was launching the second stage of her attack. I have nothing to say to reporters, she replied. I understand your caution, the man persisted, but we have information that you're trying to extort money from Kenneth Miller, taking advantage of his difficult situation. Apparently you're claiming your son is terminally ill and demanding $250,000 to keep quiet about alleged evidence of corruption. Helen leaned against the wall. Her legs felt like jelly. Sophia was more cunning than she had thought. Not only had she gotten her fired, now she was attacking her reputation, painting her as a fraud and a blackmailer. That's not true, she said weakly. Can you prove your son is actually sick? We have a copy of medical documents here that appear to be forged. The supposed evidence against Ms. King also seems highly questionable. Don't you think this is all just a desperate attempt to squeeze money from a man in crisis? Helen hung up, shaking with anger and fear. She knew this was only the beginning. Sophia had connections in the media, friends in various institutions. She could destroy Helen's life with a single phone call. But right after Kenneth called, his voice sounded tired and desperate. Helen, have you seen today's paper? He asked without a greeting. Not yet, but a reporter just called, she answered. It's a disaster. Sophia leaked the whole story to the media, but she framed it to make you look like the criminal. Cleaning lady blackmails millionaire, false corruption allegations, ailing child used in extortion plot. Helen, they have a picture of you and Michael. Helen sank heavily into a chair. Her world was collapsing, but she had to be strong for Michael. How did they get our picture? I don't know. Someone must have been following you. Sophia has a private investigator. He probably took the photos. But the worst part is, the board is calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow. They want to remove me as CEO. Helen closed her eyes. Everything they had worked for was falling apart, like a house of cards. But in that moment of desperation, she remembered something her grandmother used to say when she was a child. When all seems lost, that's when you have to be the strongest. Mr. Miller, will all the board members be at that meeting? Yes, all of them. Why do you ask? Because that's our chance. If Sophia wants to destroy me publicly, then I will publicly prove her guilt. But I'm going to need your help. What do you need? Access to the conference room an hour before the meeting. And don't tell Sophia you've spoken to me. The next day, Helen woke up at 5 a.m. She dressed with great care. The best dress she owned, black heels bought on sale, simple jewelry. She wanted to look dignified, not pretentious, like a woman who had something important to say. Michael was particularly weak that day, but he smiled at his mother as she kissed him goodbye. You're going to beat her, Mom, he said quietly. You're the strongest person I know. How could you possibly know that? She asked tenderly. Because if I had a kid, I'd want them to have a mom just like you. Helen left the apartment with tears in her eyes, but with an iron resolve in her heart. She rode the subway downtown, watching through the window as the city came to life. People hurried to work. Children went to school. The world kept spinning, indifferent to her struggle for survival. The Miller Renewables tower emerged from the morning fog like a glass giant. Helen remembered the first time she had seen the building 10 years ago, when she came looking for a job. It had seemed so imposing then, so inaccessible. Now she knew it was just glass and concrete, a structure built by people and controlled by people. Kenneth was waiting for her at a side entrance. He looked like a man who hadn't slept all night. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his tie was crooked, and he had dark circles under his eyes. The room is empty until 9, he said, leading her up the elevator to the top floor. I just hope you know what you're doing. The conference room was impressive. A long table of black granite, leather armchairs, and enormous windows with a view of the entire city. On the walls hung portraits of the company's founders and charts showing years of profit growth. This was the heart of Kenneth's empire, the place where million-dollar decisions were made. Helen laid out her documents on the table, a stack of papers covered in her fine script, printouts from websites, copies of invoices she had recreated from memory. It looked modest compared to the slick presentation Sophia had surely prepared. But Helen knew that the truth didn't need expensive packaging. At 9, the board members began to arrive. They were elegant men in expensive suits, each of them worth millions. Helen felt their gazes, surprised, disdainful, sometimes curious. To them she was an intruder, someone who didn't belong in their world. Sophia arrived last at 9:15 sharp, dressed in a cream-colored Armani suit, her hair in a perfect chignon, carrying a handbag that cost more than Helen earned in 6 months. She was the epitome of success and class, exactly what Helen could never be. "Gentlemen," Sophia said, taking her seat at the table, "we are gathered here today to discuss a very serious situation. Our company is in crisis, not only due to market fluctuations, but also because of the irresponsible decisions of our CEO." Her voice was calm, professional, convincing. She spoke of financial losses, of the erosion of investor confidence, of the need to take decisive action. "Kenneth hired an unqualified person, a cleaner, and gave her access to our most confidential data," she continued. "This person is now trying to blackmail him with fabricated evidence, using her child's illness to elicit sympathy." All eyes turned to Helen. She felt a blush creep up her cheeks, but she forced herself to hold her head high. "Don't you agree?" Sophia directed her question to the entire board, "that someone who makes such irrational decisions in a crisis is unfit to be the CEO of this company?" Silence fell. Helen could see that most of the board members had already made up their minds. A few were still wrestling with it, but even they looked convinced. Then Helen stood up. "May I say something?" she asked quietly. Sophia smiled condescendingly. "Of course. Please tell us your version of events. We're all very curious." Helen took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, her only chance to save everything she had been working for. "My name is Helen Sokolowski. For 10 years I cleaned this company's offices. And for 10 years I listened, I watched, I remembered. Because when you're invisible, people say things in front of you they would never say to someone important." Her voice grew stronger with every word. "Over these years, I watched this company grow, but I also watched as someone systematically stole from it, and today I'm going to prove it to you." Chapter 4. Helen walked over to the projector and connected her old laptop. The device looked pathetic surrounded by the state-of-the-art equipment, but its screen held a truth that no one had wanted to see. Her hands trembled slightly as she started the presentation, but her voice was as steady as steel. On March 23, 2022, Kenneth Miller held the first informal talks with the German firm Windtech about the possibility of acquiring their wind turbine division, she began, displaying the first page of her analysis. The information was top secret, known only to 3 people, Mr. Miller himself, his assistant Madeline, and Ms. Sophia King. A table with dates and amounts appeared on the screen. Helen pointed to specific entries. On March 24th, the day after that conversation, a company called Siva Lux Holdings was registered in Luxembourg. On March 28th, Siva Lux signed a consulting contract with Miller Renewables for $500,000 for an analysis of the Western European market. The money was transferred immediately. One of the board members, George Adams, an older man with grey hair, leaned over the documents. "That could be a coincidence," he said slowly. "Consulting firms often—" "Please allow me to finish," Helen interrupted. "In May 2022, Mr. Miller was planning secret negotiations with the Norwegian fund North Sea Investments. Again, only the same 3 people knew. In May, exactly 3 days before the scheduled meeting, Siva Lux received another contract, this time for $700,000 for an expert report on investment opportunities in the offshore wind energy sector." Helen clicked through the slides with a surgeon's precision. Each document was another nail in Sophia's coffin. Over 2 years, Siva Lux Holdings received a total of $4,300,000 from Miller Renewables for services it never rendered, because this company is nothing more than a P.O. box in Luxembourg and a bank account. Sophia sat rigidly in her chair, but Helen noticed tiny beads of sweat on her forehead. The elegant mask was beginning to crack. "This is all just speculation," Sophia said coolly. "Ms. Sokolowski is trying to confuse us with complicated theories to distract from her own blackmail attempts. In that case, let's clarify a few details," Helen said, undeterred. Siva Lux Holdings was registered by the law firm Berger and Associates in Luxembourg. The same law firm that Ms. King worked with to register a subsidiary in 2019. Helen showed the next document, an agreement signed by Sophia 3 years earlier. The beneficial owner of Sivalux is a charitable foundation called the European Green Future Foundation, registered in Cyprus. The president of this foundation is Maria King, your sister. A silence so profound fell over the conference room that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. All the board members were now looking at Sophia, who, for the first time, had lost her composure. This is an absurd accusation, she stammered. My sister runs a legitimate charity. The fact that her foundation might have some connection to a consulting firm doesn't mean... It doesn't mean anything? Helen cut her off sharply. Then please explain to me why the European Green Future Foundation hasn't donated a single dollar to any charitable project in the last 2 years, but it did purchase a villa in Saint-Tropez for $2 million and a yacht, the Marina Dream, for $1.2 million. Both purchases were finalized in your sister's name. Helen displayed photos from the internet. A luxurious villa with a pool overlooking the Mediterranean, an elegant yacht moored in an exclusive marina. The contrast between that opulence and the modest room they were all sitting in was glaring. I checked customs records, Helen continued. The yacht was primarily used by you, Miss King, and your friends. I have photos from social media where you're posing on the deck during your vacation last year. A photo of Sophia in a white bikini, a glass of champagne in hand against a backdrop of blue water, appeared on the screen. She looked beautiful and carefree, but now that picture had become evidence of her guilt. George Adams stood up. His face was red with anger. Sophia, is this true? He asked hoarsely. You've been stealing from us for 2 years? This can all be explained, Sophia said, trying to regain control. My sister's company does receive commissions from various energy firms. It's standard business practice. And if someone is misinterpreting, then perhaps you can explain this. Helen switched to the final slide. A photo of a document with a handwritten signature appeared on the screen. This is a note in your handwriting. I found it in the trash in your office 6 months ago. You wrote, K planning meeting with Norwegians 5:15. Prep Sivalux contract for 700K. M needs to send docs to Lux by Thurs. The document was a phone picture, blurry, but the text was legible. Helen remembered it word for word because she had copied it into her notebook that same night. M is your sister Maria, Helen added, and the only Norwegians Mr. Miller was planning to meet in May were from North Sea Investments. Sophia shot up from her chair, knocking it over. I will not be blackmailed by some cleaning lady, she shouted. Kenneth, are you really going to believe this woman who is trying to destroy everything we built together? Do you remember how we started? In a garage with one computer and a dream of clean energy. I was with you from day one. That's exactly why this is so painful, Kenneth replied quietly. I trusted you like a sister, and all this time you were stealing from me. I wasn't stealing. Sophia was hysterical now. I deserved that money. I worked 17 hours a day building this with you, and you paid me pennies compared to what you made. So you decided to give yourself a raise, Helen stated dryly. But that's not all. When I started this investigation, you tried to destroy me. First you had me illegally fired, then you spread lies to the media. Helen showed printouts of the newspaper articles. You contacted a reporter and fed him a fabricated story about me blackmailing Mr. Miller. You told him my son's medical records were fake. Sophia was now pale as a sheet. Her elegant hairstyle was coming undone, strands of hair sticking out in different directions. Is the boy really sick? One of the board members asked. With leukemia, Helen answered quietly. He's 16. He may only have months left, and his only chance is an experimental treatment in Germany. It costs $250,000. And you agreed to help Mr. Miller in exchange for him funding the treatment? Yes, but it wasn't just about the money, Helen said, looking at Kenneth. It was about justice, about the truth, about making sure that the people who worked honestly didn't have to pay for someone who was stealing from them. George Adams turned to Sophia. Sophia, you have 3 minutes to explain yourself, or we're calling the police. The police? Sophia laughed, but it sounded hysterical. On what grounds? The handwritten notes of some cleaning lady. Vacation photos. This isn't evidence, it's innuendo. In that case, you'll have no problem turning over the files from your computer, Kenneth said, and from your bank accounts, and the documents from your sister's foundation. Sophia burst into tears. These weren't the elegant tears of a movie star, but the ugly, desperate sobs of a woman who knows she's been caught. Mascara streamed down her cheeks, leaving black streaks. You don't understand, she said through her tears, turning to Kenneth. It's not that simple. I had debts. My ex-husband left me with a mortgage and a car loan. Maria needed money for her own medical treatments. I wanted to tell you, but you never had time for personal problems. So you decided to solve your problems by stealing from my company, Kenneth stated coldly. It wasn't stealing, Sophia screamed. They were advances on future commissions. I planned to pay it all back as soon as the company became more profitable. $4 million in advances. George Adams shook his head in disbelief. Sophia, you've ruined this company. Because of your advances, Kenneth is on the brink of bankruptcy. Helen looked at Sophia with a mixture of pity and outrage. She understood desperation, the need to save loved ones, the struggle with debt. But she couldn't understand how someone could hurt innocent people for their own gain. Ms. King, she said quietly, I know what it's like to need money for a sick child. I know what it's like to lie awake at night, wondering where you're going to find the funds for treatment. But it would never have occurred to me to steal from the people who trusted me. You don't understand, Sophia shrieked like a wounded animal. You don't know what it's like to be responsible for the success of this company and get nothing for it. To watch Kenneth buy himself another new car while I could barely make ends meet. I paid you $750,000 a year plus bonuses, Kenneth replied. That's more than most bank presidents make. It wasn't enough. Sophia was completely unhinged. I wanted a normal life. I wanted to be able to buy nice things, go on vacation, not worry about every single penny. The silence that followed her words was louder than a scream. Everyone in the room finally understood Sophia's true motivation. It wasn't the desperation of a mother fighting for her child's life. It was simple greed, envy of another's success. This meeting is adjourned, George Adams said, rising from his seat. Sophia King is immediately terminated from all positions within this company. She has until tomorrow to clear out her office and return all company property. This matter will be turned over to the district attorney's office. George, please, Sophia pleaded, trying to salvage the situation. We can work something out. Don't make me a criminal. You made yourself a criminal, he replied mercilessly. 20 years of professional respect, 20 years of friendship, and you destroyed it all for money. Helen watched as Sophia left the conference room. The woman who had seemed invincible just an hour ago now looked like a broken doll. Her elegant suit was wrinkled, her hair was a mess, her makeup was smeared. Her career was most likely over forever. But Helen didn't feel triumphant. She only felt an immense sense of relief and a profound exhaustion. The fight was over, but her son still needed treatment. Chapter 5. After Sophia left, a silence so thick you could cut it with a knife descended on the conference room. Helen stood by the projector, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from her body, leaving behind trembling hands and an empty feeling in her stomach. For the last half hour, she had been a warrior. Now she was once again just a mother, worried about her sick son. Kenneth was the first to break the silence. Gentlemen, I think we have enough material to rebuild investor confidence, he said, though his voice sounded weary. George, can you handle the media? We need to get our version of events out there before Sophia has a chance to spread any more rumors. George Adams nodded. I'm calling our press secretary now. And what about Ms. Sokolowski? He looked at Helen with respect in his eyes. Can she count on our support? Helen felt her heart leap into her throat. After so many years of being invisible, she was suddenly the center of attention, and she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. The only thing I need is the treatment for my son, she replied quietly. Mr. Miller already promised me that. That's not all, Kenneth said, getting up and walking to the window overlooking the city. New York stretched out before them like a scale model, thousands of people living out their own small dramas. Helen saved this company. Without her, we would have lost everything. I think she deserves more than a one-time payment. What do you mean? Helen asked, not daring to trust her own ears. I want to offer you a permanent position, Director of Financial Analysis, a salary of $120,000 a year plus bonuses, and of course full health insurance for you and your son. Helen sank heavily into a chair. The sum he mentioned was more than she had earned in the last 5 years combined. But beyond the money, she felt something else. Recognition, respect. Someone had finally valued her skills. But I don't have the education, she said uncertainly. I only have a couple of years of community college and then for 10 years you observed the most complex financial operations and memorized every detail, Kenneth interrupted. You have skills that can't be taught at any university. Intuition, analytical thinking, and above all, integrity. George Adams nodded in approval. I agree with Kenneth. After what you've shown us today, you're the best analyst this company could have. Helen felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her whole life, others had told her who she could be, what she could hope for, what her place was. Now for the first time, someone saw her as more than just a cleaner. I accept, she said, trying to keep her voice from trembling, but on one condition. What's that? I want the company to create a scholarship fund for the children of employees who can't afford an education, so that other kids have the chances I never had. Kenneth smiled for the first time that day. That's a brilliant idea. We'll call it Michael's Fund. The next few days passed in a whirlwind. The media buzzed with the story of Sophia King's spectacular downfall and the heroic actions of the detective cleaner, as they called Helen. Some articles were supportive, others ironic, but all of them admitted that her analysis had been masterful. Helen moved into a new office on the 5th floor with a view of the Hudson River and a modern computer that was 10 times faster than her laptop at home. The first week was difficult. She felt like an intruder in a world where she didn't belong. Other employees looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Could this woman who just yesterday was cleaning their offices really be their superior? But Helen quickly proved her worth. She identified several other discrepancies in the books, proposed new control systems, and established procedures to prevent similar abuses in the future. Her ability to spot patterns and anomalies proved invaluable, and most importantly, Michael was approved for treatment in Hamburg. Helen would never forget the moment Professor Schneider called with the results of the first tests. "Your son is responding excellently to the therapy," he said in German, as a translator relayed his words. "The leukemia is receding much faster than we anticipated. There is a chance for a full recovery." Helen cried into the phone, unable to believe what she was hearing. For months, she had been preparing for the worst, and now there was real hope. Kenneth was with her when she took that call. They were in his office discussing another financial report when the phone rang. He watched her expression change from tension to disbelief to pure joy. "Michael's going to live," she said when she hung up. "He's really going to live." Kenneth stood up and walked over to her. In his eyes, Helen saw something she hadn't expected: tenderness, concern, something more than just professional respect. "I'm so happy," he said quietly. "I'm so happy." For a moment, they stood so close that Helen could smell his aftershave and feel the warmth of his body. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt like a woman, not just a mother fighting for her son's survival. "Helen," Kenneth said, his voice as gentle as a touch, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Would you have dinner with me? Not as an employee with her boss, but as two people who have been through something important together." Helen felt her heart start to beat faster. She hadn't expected this. For the past few months, she had been completely focused on saving Michael and rebuilding her life. Romance was the last thing on her mind. "I don't know if that's a good idea," she said uncertainly. "We work together. People might get the wrong idea." "People will always talk," Kenneth replied, "but we know what's real between us, and I've never met anyone like you. Your strength, your intelligence, the way you fight for what you believe in, it's rare." Helen looked into his eyes. She saw sincerity, but also loneliness. She realized that Kenneth, for all his wealth and status, was just as lonely as she was, that after Sophia's betrayal, he had lost faith in people and was now trying to rebuild it. "One dinner," she said finally, "but no expensive restaurants. I want to go somewhere I can just be myself." Kenneth smiled. "I know just the place." The following evening, they went to a small restaurant in Greenwich Village that served traditional pierogies. Kenneth looked out of place in the simple interior, like an aristocrat who had wandered in among commoners. But once they started talking, the differences between them ceased to matter. "I know this is going to sound strange," he said, cutting into his pork cutlet, "but since I met you for the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something meaningful, that my work has a purpose." "Why?" "Because I see it through your eyes. I no longer see just numbers and profits, but the people who work for this company, their families, their dreams. You've taught me that business isn't just about money." Helen listened, eating pierogies with cabbage and mushrooms that reminded her of the ones she used to make with her grandmother as a child. She felt at ease, for the first time in months, not worrying about Michael, about money, about the future. "And what do you think about all these changes?" Kenneth asked. "Sometimes I feel like it's all a dream," she answered honestly, "that I'm going to wake up in my kitchen in Queens and Michael will be sick and I'll be a cleaner with no hope for anything better." "It's not a dream," Kenneth said, reaching across the table and touching her hand. "This is your real life, the life you deserve." His touch was warm and steady. Helen didn't pull her hand away. "Maybe you're right," she said softly. They walked back through a quiet New York. It was late. The streets glistened from the rain, and the streetlights reflected in the puddles like golden stars. Helen felt young, in a way she hadn't felt in years. She walked beside Kenneth, listening to him talk about his childhood, his dreams, the mistakes he had made. "I wanted to be someone important," he said, "to prove to everyone that nothing could stop me, and in the end, it turned out that the most important things were right there beside me, but I was too blind to see them." "Like what?" He stopped and turned to face her, like the fact that a person's true worth isn't measured by how much they earn, but by how they treat others, that sometimes the greatest wisdom is found in the quietest people, and that love can come at the most unexpected moment and in the most unexpected form. Helen felt a blush creep up her cheeks. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what his words implied, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw nothing but good intentions. "Kenneth," she said quietly, "I'm not like the women you've known. I don't know how to dress elegantly. I don't know about wine. I don't speak several languages. But you have something they never did," he replied. "You have a heart." He kissed her gently, under a streetlight on an empty street. It was Helen's first kiss since her husband's death, the first moment she allowed herself to think of herself not as a mother or an employee, but as a woman. And for the first time in months, she felt that the future could be beautiful. Chapter 6. 6 months later, New York looked different to Helen. The same streets, the same buildings, but everything had taken on new meaning and color. She was sitting in a cafe near Washington Square Park, waiting for Michael, who was returning from his final checkup in Hamburg. Through the window, she watched the passers-by, students hurrying to class, tourists taking pictures of a historic church, mothers with strollers walking through the park. Her life had changed so radically that sometimes she had to remind herself that it had all really happened, that the woman in an elegant suit from an American designer, with her own credit cards and keys to an apartment in the city, was really her, Helen Sokolowski, who just a year ago had been cleaning offices on the night shift. The most important thing, however, was that Michael was alive. Not just alive, but thriving. The latest tests showed that the leukemia was completely gone. Professor Schneider called it a medical miracle, but Helen knew it wasn't a miracle. It was science, determination, and love, a combination that could move mountains. The cafe door opened with a jingle, and her son walked in. Michael was 20 now. His hair had grown back thick and dark. His cheeks had color, and his eyes had that spark of life Helen hadn't seen for so long. He was now a freshman studying computer science at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, thanks to a scholarship from Michael's fund, which Kenneth's company had established for employees' children. "Mom!" He hugged her tightly. "Everything's fine. The professor said I can live a normal life now. No restrictions, no special medications. I'm healthy." Helen closed her eyes, feeling relief and joy fill every cell in her body. For years, she had been preparing herself for the possibility of losing the most important person in her life. Now, she could finally allow herself to plan for a future without fear. "How was Hamburg?" she asked once they were seated at a table. "Great. The professor offered me an internship in his lab for next summer. He wants me to help with research on new therapies. He said my experience as a patient could be valuable for other sick kids." Helen listened with pride. Her son had not only survived, but he also wanted to help others. The illness that could have destroyed him had become a source of his strength and calling. "So, how are things with Mr. Miller?" Michael asked with a mischievous grin. "When are you going to officially introduce him as your boyfriend?" Helen blushed. Her relationship with Kenneth was developing slowly, cautiously, but steadily. They had been seeing each other regularly for 6 months, but they were still learning how to be a couple. They were both people who had been through difficult experiences and were not inclined to make rash decisions. "It's complicated," she replied. "We work together, people talk, and I'm a bit older than him." "Mom, you're 38 and he's 32. That's not a big difference. Besides, I've seen the way he looks at you. That's love." Helen smiled. Michael was growing up, becoming wiser and more mature than many of his peers. His illness had taught him to appreciate life and not waste time on trivialities. "And what about you? Is there someone special?" she asked, changing the subject. "Maybe," he replied with a mysterious smile. "There's this girl in my year, Anna. She's pre-med, wants to be a pediatric oncologist. We met at a support group for former oncology patients." Helen felt a warmth in her heart. Michael was finding love with someone who understood his experiences, who wanted to help others. It was beautiful. That evening Helen was meeting Kenneth, not at a restaurant or the theater, but at his house. He was cooking dinner for her, for the first time by himself, which she considered a major step forward for a man who had previously only eaten in expensive restaurants or ordered catering. "How did it go at the hospital?" he asked, flipping pork chops in the pan. "Perfectly. Michael is officially healthy. He can live a normal life, study, love, dream about the future." Kenneth turned and hugged her tightly. Helen could feel his relief. Over the months he had grown to love Michael like his own son, and worried about him no less than she did. "And I have a surprise for you," he said once they were at the table. "We got the results of the investigation into Sophia today." Helen felt a strange pang in her stomach. Sophia? a name that had long been synonymous with fear and anger. Now it evoked more sadness and pity. The DA has charged her with embezzling $4 million. She could get up to 8 years in prison, Kenneth continued, but it will probably end with a suspended sentence and an order to repay the money. Most of the funds have already been secured by the authorities in Luxembourg. And how is she handling all of this? Helen asked. Kenneth looked at her in disbelief. Are you really worried about her after she tried to destroy you? I worry about any human being who has lost everything, Helen replied quietly. Sophia made a mistake, a huge mistake, but she's still a person. She has a family, feelings, her own suffering. Kenneth shook his head in admiration. That's the thing about you, he said, that you have a heart even for those who have wronged you. It's a rare quality. It's not about forgiveness, Helen explained. It's about not letting someone else's anger or envy poison my heart. I've been through too much to waste time on hatred. They ate dinner in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Kenneth reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Helen, he said seriously, I know this might be too soon. I know our lives are complicated, that people will talk, that we're not a typical couple. But I also know that I've never met a woman like you. It's not just your intelligence or your courage. It's who you are on the inside. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, not a huge diamond, but an elegant, simple gold band with a small sapphire. Will you marry me? Helen stared at the ring, feeling her heart leap into her throat. The man who, just a year ago, had been as unattainable as the moon was now asking for her hand. But this wasn't about money or status. It was about love, about a shared future, about building something beautiful from the broken pieces of their lives. Yes, she said, feeling tears of happiness in her eyes. Yes, I will. As Kenneth slid the ring onto her finger, Helen thought about the strange paths life takes. A year ago, she had been crying in an empty office over documents that could save her son. She never expected that desperate act would change not only her life, but also the life of the man who was now proposing to her. But on one condition, she added with a smile. What's that? No big ceremony. I want a simple wedding, just our closest family and friends. And I want Michael to walk me down the aisle. Deal, Kenneth smiled. And I want George Adams to be my best man. He was the first one to recognize your worth. The next few months flowed by like a calm river. Helen continued to work at the company, which was thriving better than ever. Investor confidence had returned, and the story of the detective cleaner had become a marketing asset. It showed that the company valued integrity and talent, regardless of background. Michael's fund had already awarded its first annual scholarships to 20 young people from employees' families. Helen personally met each recipient, learning about their dreams and plans. She saw in their eyes the same determination she once had when she dreamed of a better life for her son. Michael fell head over heels for Anna, and they were planning a future together in medicine. Helen watched them with a smile, seeing herself and her late husband from 20 years ago. Youth, hope, infinite possibilities. Sophia received a 2-year suspended sentence and was ordered to repay the money. Helen ran into her on the street a few weeks after the trial. Sophia looked older, wore modest clothes, but her eyes no longer held the desperate anger of a year ago. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for everything I did to you. I know, Helen replied. I hope you find peace. They didn't talk for long, but Helen walked away with the feeling that a chapter in her life had finally closed. The wedding took place in a small church in the village that December, when New York was draped in snow like lace. Helen didn't look like a fairy tale princess. She wore a simple white dress she'd bought at a department store, with a modest hairstyle and delicate makeup. But as she walked down the aisle on Michael's arm, she felt like the most beautiful woman in the world. Kenneth was waiting at the altar in a dark suit, a small white rose in his buttonhole. When Helen stood beside him, he took her hand and said softly, You made me believe that true love exists. And you made me believe I deserve to be happy, she replied. After the ceremony, there was a modest dinner at the restaurant Helen had chosen, the same one where they had their first date. The guests were their closest friends and family, Michael and Anna, George Adams and his wife, a few colleagues, and Helen's neighbor from Queens, who had helped care for Michael for years. There were no fireworks or an orchestra, but there was something more important: the genuine joy of people who loved each other and celebrated their loved one's happiness. As evening fell, Helen and Kenneth sat alone in their new home together, a spacious apartment overlooking the Hudson, which was to be the home for their newly formed family. Did you ever think the story would end like this? Kenneth asked, sitting beside her on the sofa. Never, she answered honestly. When I walked into your office that night, I was only thinking about Michael, about how to save him. I never expected that I would also save myself. And me, Kenneth added. You're my savior. Helen shook her head. I saved myself, you just helped me do it. They sat in silence looking out the window at the city lights. New York glittered like jewels scattered on black velvet, and somewhere out there, in those thousands of windows, lived other families, other women fighting for their children, other people dreaming of a better life. You know what? Helen said softly. What? I think every one of us has the strength inside to change our lives. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us who we really are. Kenneth kissed her gently. And sometimes we need someone to show us that true value isn't in what we have, but in who we are. Outside, snow was falling, just as it had on the night it all began. But now Helen didn't feel fear or desperation. She felt peace, hope, and love, everything she hadn't had for so long. Her story had begun with tears of despair in an empty office. It ended with a smile of hope in a warm home, with the man she loved by her side and a son who had his whole life ahead of him. Sometimes, fate writes the most beautiful stories for those who least expect them. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Helen and Michael has touched your hearts. Don't you see a piece of your own life in it? That same courage we find within ourselves when we fight for our loved ones. That same strength that allows us to endure the toughest moments. If you want to continue experiencing stories about people who refuse to give up despite the odds, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like. In the comments, share with us, which part of this story moved you the most? Was it the determination of a mother fighting for her child, or perhaps the discovery that true love arrives when we least expect it? Every day, we tell stories of human strength, dignity, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people who do extraordinary things, because we are all the heroes of our own stories. Sometimes we just have to turn the next page to see it. We look forward to your words, your stories, your hearts. See you in the next episode.